flock. He led them beyond the wilderness, where he came to the Mount Horeb, or Sinai in other traditions, the mountain of God. This is the first time that we hear directly from God in the book of Exodus. There, Moses experiences a theophany, a divine manifestation of God in the form of a flame of fire out of a bush, where he hears from the angel or messenger of God. Clearly here, the English translation angel is not a winged heavenly being. God appears in many manifestations. The text says that Moses looked at the blazing bush. I imagine that he didn't just look, but stared. Now, if he wore glasses, he probably would have removed them, looked at them and replaced them, and then looked once more in disbelief at this bush that was ablaze, but not consumed. Finally, his curiosity gets the best of him, and he moves closer for a better look. The translation in many of our English Bibles for the Hebrew verb shur is to turn aside. He says, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. But it can also be translated, I must examine this great sight, meaning he must investigate this phenomenon in greater detail to determine its nature. Another translation is, I must detour from my present course and see what's going on. I must turn aside and look. If we are honest, some of us have only just now turned aside to see the fires of racial injustice burning in America. I am not talking about the fires in Kenosha or Portland or Minneapolis. I mean the fires that burned in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles in 1965, and in Newark, New Jersey and Detroit, Michigan in 1967. The riots in major metropolitan cities in the United States were a byproduct of centuries of urban blight, abandonment, redlining, economic disparity, and racial discord. What precipitated each of these riots were exchanges between Black residents and white police officers. President Lyndon Johnson appointed Illinois Governor Otto Kerner to oversee the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders in Urban Neighborhoods in the US. Commonly referred to as the Kerner Commission, in 1968, the commission released its report. They blamed poor policing practices by white officers against Black citizens and persistent racially discriminatory policies for the riots. The commission concluded that the nation was, quote, moving toward two societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal. Discrimination and segregation have long permeated much of American life. They now threaten the future of every American, end quote. The commission offered remedies for the problem. However, President Johnson was angered by their conclusions and rejected the findings in the report. Thus, we were bound to repeat history. American author James Baldwin appears to portend the 1960s race-related civil disturbances in his 1963 nonfiction book, The Fire Next Time, that contained just 2 essays. He writes about race relations between Blacks and whites and white resistance to the rollback of de jure segregation and white supremacy in America at the height of the civil rights movement. The book title comes from 2 verses in the antebellum Negro spiritual, Mary, Don't You Weep, which speaks of God's coming judgment of their oppressors. God gave Moses the rainbow sign. No more water, but fire next time. Oh, Mary, don't you weep. In 1992, Rodney King was pulled over for an alleged traffic violation by 4 police officers in Los Angeles. An unarmed King was severely beaten by the police, and the encounter was captured on video. When the officers were acquitted of the assault charges, rioting broke out shortly after, and buildings burned. Maybe we have turned aside and looked, but did we stop to investigate the cause of the fire burning, but not consumed? Are we like the words in the communion prayer of confession at Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago, where members confess that we have closed our eyes and pretended not to see the injustices, the racism, and the evil which pervade our everyday lives? Moses did not just turn aside and look, but he also listened. When God saw that Moses had turned aside to see, God calls to him from the bush. Moses responds, "Here I am," a stereotypical response of obedient submission of a subordinate to one's superior. However, Moses does not know the correct posture to assume because he has not been instructed in how to approach the God of Israel. So God directs him to come no closer until he has removed the sandals from his feet. God further explains to Moses in whose presence he is. "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Abraham, and the God of Jacob." One scholar suggests that the emphasis on father instead of ancestors is to help Moses understand the intimate relationship of this God to Moses' father, who worshiped God perhaps at this very mountain. At the conclusion of Moses' encounter with the divine representative in the bush, God calls Moses to return to Egypt, back to face Pharaoh, to ask him to release God's people to worship God on the same mountain, this sacred holy place. At this point, I would like to note that the Hebrew root word for to see occurs at least 9 times in this passage. From to look, to observe, to appear, the significance of seeing should not be overlooked. Turning aside and looking leads to doing the work of justice and liberation. Bracketing Exodus 3:1-6 is Exodus 2:25, where God looked upon the Israelites and took notice of their suffering, and Exodus 3:7, where God frames God's call to Moses around having observed the misery of the Israelites and heard their cries. Anti-racist work is not easy because racism is so entrenched in American society, religion, and politics. However, as God's people, we are not without hope. The Kerner Commission added that, quote, "This deepening racial division is not inevitable. The movement apart can be reversed. What the rioters appeared to be seeking was fuller participation in the social order and the material benefits enjoyed by the majority of American citizens. Rather than rejecting the American system, they were anxious to obtain a place for themselves in it," end quote. But before authentic efforts can be undertaken, we must first turn aside and look, listen for God, and realize that where we find ourselves performing this work, where God is present, it is holy ground. Amen.